audience, and she's saying, welcome to our seminar, which is organized by Jazeera Mubashir and the Jazeera Study Center under the title of restructuring the balance of power and the drives behind Russian invasion to Ukraine, and we will be discussing all of these topics and more. The first session of this seminar, which is about under the title the Russian-Ukrainian relationships, the friction, the continuous friction, and we will overview the history and the social and racial and religious relations between the two neighboring countries, with a focus on the evolvement of their political relationship since the announcement of the Soviet Union collapse and recognition of the independence of its countries. Now we welcome our audience via Skype from Jeddah, Dr. Basim Al-Haj, the author and political writer, and from Tripoli we have Dr. Wissam Qal'aji, a member of the Ru'ya Strategic Center, Russia and the Islamic World, and from Doha, Dr. Petro Petrovsky, the Ukrainian analyst. Welcome all of you to our seminar. I shall start with Dr. Basim Al-Haj Jassim, the writer and the political researcher. Dr. Basim, Russia and Ukraine are a neighboring country and they have so many historic relationship. What are the major history stops that evolved the relation between the two countries? The guest is now responding, saying that in reality there's a very complicated and intertwined relation socially, religiously between Russia and Ukraine. Both countries have roots in the Eastern Slavic empire that started in the 9th century. But even both countries have two distinctive history and two cultures and two languages have emerged, although they are very close, and Russia have evolved into an empire. However, Ukraine, in its history, there were so many obstacles while building their empire, and in the 17th century, large lands of Ukraine was a part of the Russian empire, a vast region, and other region were part of the Polish country until the Russian empire collapsed in 1917. And there's also a period, or a very short period, only a few number of years, where Ukraine have become independent. However, this did not last for long, where the Soviet Russia have control again the most of the Ukrainian region, and then the relationship have become an internal relationship, rather international, until the collapse of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 90s. Then a new era have started, an era that was also full of complications and also aspiration for the future, whether for the concerns of Russia and the desire and ambitions of Ukraine to join the Western alliances and unions, just like what happened with the Eastern European countries who were part of the Warsaw Treaty. Of course, after the 90s of the previous century and the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were so many stops in the relationship between Moscow and Kiev from one side, and these all different tensions and friction. And we can summarize it that in 2014 there was the beginning of a new phase with the Orange Revolution, which was against an ally of Moscow. Afterwards, we have witnessed a kind of friction, and that period Russia have used the gas weapon in order to cut line the supplies on Ukraine and even in Europe that go through Ukraine. However, the era or the period that have prelude to this crisis that we are witnessing was in the year 2014 when the Ukrainian president Yanukovych back then, who was Russian affiliates, refused to sign an economic agreement with the European Union. At that year, the Croatian community was divided into two parties, a party that is loyal to the West, another to Moscow. At that year also, Russia have annexed the Crimea, and we have witnessed movements in the Donbass, the eastern Asia, in Lugansk, and there was also a referendum, and then things start to evolve. We have witnessed the Normandy party and the Minsk agreement in order to reach a ceasefire that time, but those agreements were not successful, and Ukraine also increased their desire to join the Western community, especially the NATO. And in the year 2019, there was also NATO was a direct target for Ukraine, and even the constitution has reflected that. And also at that time, the Western countries, including the US, have increased the military support and also provided training for the Ukrainian forces, and also they have created maneuvers and exercises in the Black Sea. All of those actions, the Russia have perceived it as a direct threat to it, until we have reached that era where the crisis took place. We have seen a military operation, a special military operation that the Russians have called it a military operation. However, the Ukrainians have called it a war, an invasion. Ukraine have become a victim for a bigger struggle. It became in a direct fire of the Russia, and it is like a proxy war. It's not that's not a threat the Ukraine, but even a wider region. So now the anchor is saying now there are so many ups and downs the Russian and Ukraine relationship have went through. That relationship was featured so many aspirations, and now I ask Dr. Wasim Qal'ajiyya, the member of the Vision Strategic Group. The Russian call Ukraine as the small Russia, and which country of them is the original or the origin? The guest from Tarablos, Lebanon, is thanking the anchor for the invitation, and he says Ukraine is a part and parcel of the history of Russia. He says that لطالما Kiev was considered the region of all the Slavic cultures, culturally speaking, religiously speaking. Both countries have root in the Eastern Slavic country, which called Kiev Rus. Therefore, the Vladimir Putin, when he say it's one people, however, without two different paths. So the origin in the building Kiev Rus as a city came through the history in the 9th century, when the Slavic tribes moved from Volga River to the south to settle around Kiev Rus, which is now form the current region, which is Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Russia. This is what describe Kiev Rus. But that was a history. Now we are talking about modern Ukraine. We're talking about Ukraine, the 19th century Ukraine. Ukraine that was divided into kingdoms and countries all the way to the 19th century when the war took, the Russian-Polish war took place, and the world was divided based on Sadronov a treaty, and the Soviet Union was established. At the beginning of the Soviet Union, Soviet Ukraine was established, and Western public Ukraine, people of Ukraine was started, which did not continue for a long time, and entered into war with Poland to become later on to be a time where Poland occupied that region and added or annexed it to Poland, and then to sign an agreement between Ukraine and the Soviet Union agreement, the Riga treaty, where Poland will recognize Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine, and the Soviet Union will recognize the annexation of Western Ukraine, which is Galicia and Vorina, to Poland. And therefore, and hence, we lost, the anchor is saying we have lost our connection with Dr. Wasim, who was telling us about the historical background of both countries. Now we have with Dr. Wasim back. Now, Mr. Wasim is saying that now we talk about the historical background from the 19th century when Ukraine was divided into two parts. The first, which was under the Soviet Empire, under the Soviet Union system, and the Western Ukraine independent country. But however, the Polish-Ukraine war, when Western Ukraine Republic was defeated before the Poland, and Poland control Galicia and Vorina, and afterwards Poland tried to expand toward but they countered the Bolsheviks, and then they signed the Riga Treaty, where Poland recognized, based on those peace agreement with Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine, and the Soviet Union also recognized the western part of Ukraine as part of the Polish Republic. This continued until Ukraine was considered one of the founding countries in the Soviet Union, and that also last to 1939, when Nazis Germany have invaded Poland and removed it from the plan as an independent country. Then the Soviet Unions have went forward and was able to free Galicia, Eastern Galicia and Vorina, and annex them back again to Soviet Ukraine with the borders that we know today. This is, if we talk about the historical overview for Ukraine. We can talk, of course, long about the relationship between the Soviet Union and Ukraine, which continued till 1992, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine have left the Soviet Union system to the independent countries system to remain within the dynamic geography of Moscow. This dynamic geography of the independent countries alliance, Budapest Treaty was added to that for when Ukraine have give away voluntarily their nuclear weapons to Russia in or against guarantees that were given to Ukraine based on the Budapest Treaty, and both Russia and the United States of America and the United Kingdom guaranteed the independence of Ukraine and recognizes Ukraine as an independent country. Now the anchor is interrupting Dr. Yassim, and now they're moving to you, Dr. Petro. Mr. Petro, President Putin have written an article talking about the linkages between both nations, how the Ukrainian perceive those connection between both nations, and how the Ukrainian figure out those similarities and the differences between the both nations.
First of all, I want to begin from to thank you for this invitation and for the opportunity to tell our view, the Ukrainian view about the war and about the origins and the consequences of the war. So you asked about the article Putin wrote last summer in July, which were published in the official website of Putin and even translated into Ukrainian. So it was nothing new for us to read this article, especially for the people who were born as myself during the Soviet times and who studied in schools during the Soviet times, because Putin did nothing more than just retelling the narrative which was written in the Soviet textbooks of history of, as they call it, the Soviet Union. However, if we look closer, that was the history of Russia, where there is no place for any other nations which were seized by Russian Empire and first of all by Moscow Kingdom, then by Russian Empire, and then by the Bolsheviks, communists, after the collapse of the Russian Empire and during the Soviet times. So therefore, first we must tell to the world that the many things, even the things that I've heard from the respected speakers today, they are not true. Simply, they were imposed by the official Russian and later Soviet authorities as an official view on the history. And in fact, this history was falsified to a much extent. For instance, I've heard just today, the first speaker said that the Ukraine belonged, the part of Ukraine belonged to the Russian Empire since the middle of the 17th century. However, the fact and the historical fact, which is supported even by the Arab chronicles and by the chronicles written in the Europe by those time historians, and that was the not the Russian Empire. Russian Empire was established in 1721, which is the end of the first quarter of the 18th century. And since the middle of 17th century until the end of 18th century, Ukraine existed as an independent state and was gradually merged and conquered by the Moscow Kingdom, and later by the in the second half of the 18th century by the Russian Empire. So, however, the official Russian narrative is that in the middle of 17th century, Ukraine reunited with the Moscow Kingdom, which is also not true. That was a treaty between the Prince of Ukraine, the commander of the Cossacks army, and the Moscow King. And that was the treaty of two independent sovereigns, the heads of the two independent states. However, that was twisted by the Russian narrative that it was a reunification of the one people in the one country. That was not the fact. Another problem with Russian narrative is that they tried to hide atrocities done to the Ukrainians throughout the history of Russian Empire and Soviet Union, beginning from the fact that Ukrainian language was prohibited to use in books or in a playwrights or in the theaters since the middle of the 19th century. And since the middle of the 19th century, Russian authorities and later Soviet authorities, they conducted a deliberate policy of Russification, of denying Ukrainians a right to speak its native language and trying to make them Russians and force them to speak Russians. So it was a kind of cultural genocide. Then Ukrainian schools were prohibited to exist, and then Ukrainians were forced to send their children to the Russian schools and speak Russian. Later on, during the Bolsheviks and during the communist regimes, the Soviet authorities, they organized the artificial famine in 1932 and 1933, and according to the modest estimates, around 3 million people just perished because of hunger. And the truth about this artificial famine, which also we can say is an example of genocide, was hidden and was prohibited to mention until the very end of the Soviet Union. Only in the last year of the Soviet Union, in 1990, the truth was allowed to be published, and the first evidence of the artificial famine were published, and people were just shocked by the fact that it was done by the Communist Party. Nobody knew. And even the memory, even the living memory among the people was prohibited. People were afraid to share these memories with their children, with their grandchildren, under the threat of the prosecution and repressions. And also, in the same manner, the Russians tried to conceal and to hide the truth that Ukrainians during the 20th century struggled 2 times to gain independence. First, it was mentioned by 2 speakers that after the collapse of the Russian Empire, Ukrainians did won their independence for 4 years, but later they are defeated by the communists. However, during the Second World War, there was another attempt. Then Ukrainians fought against both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, Communist Soviet Union, but also failed. So yes, the main Russian narrative is that, and it was we can see it easily in the Putin's article, that Ukrainians never existed as an independent nation, which is quite contradictory to the historical facts written in different sources, including Russian sources then, and even the Western sources. So, and right now, in the last 8 years, Russians also did many efforts to conceal the fact that they invaded Ukraine and that they occupied parts of Ukraine, Crimean Peninsula, and parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk region, and they try to frame this invasion in 2014 as an attempt to save Ukraine from Western influence. While the fact is that Ukraine, since the beginning of independence, really wanted to integrate to the West, but not because of the Western influence, but because there was an experience of poor living in the Soviet Union, while the Europe was an example of high living standards and of high economic standards. And people just wanted to live better than during the Soviet times. And since Russia did not propose any opportunities for the equal development, then yes, people looked for the West and for the Europe, especially for the European countries, and wanted to join Europe in order to upgrade and develop the social and economic standards. And another Russian narrative is that Ukraine is under influence of NATO and that NATO is pushing Ukraine into confrontation with the West. So this is also could be debunked and could be disagreed, could be rejected very easily if we look at the public opinion polls which my institution conducts since 1994. And if we look at the figures, so before the war in 2012, before Russia invaded in Ukraine for the first time, only 13% of Ukrainians believed that NATO is the best option for the national security of the country. Just imagine the figure, just 12% wanted to join NATO or looked for the NATO as the best option for security. But after Russia invaded Ukraine, after it seized Crimea, after it started atrocities in Donbass, So in the May 2014, the number of people who thought that NATO membership is the best option for Ukraine's security increased to 36%. And in December 2014, this was 46%. So, and then there was just in the end of the December 2021, when Russia threatened Ukraine, and when Russia amassed its troops on the border, again, this number of supporters of NATO that increased to 53%. So the reality is, and this is supported by the reliable and valid public opinion, that Russia, by its own actions, increased support for NATO membership among Ukrainians. And especially in the last 8 years, the support for NATO membership as the way to protect Ukraine against Russian invasion increased specifically in the eastern and southern regions of Ukraine. These are regions are the close to the combat zone in Donbass since 2014 until 2021. So people saw how Russia is using military force to intimidate and to kill people, and they looked for the alternative. And the only viable alternative in Europe, we have only NATO. So to sum it up, Putin's policy, if we look at the facts, Putin's policy failed in two dimensions. First, it is based on the falsification and fabrication of the historical facts, on denying of the historical facts. And secondly, Putin's actions for the last 20 years of his presidency, of his control over the Russia, by his actions, he did everything to make Ukrainians believe that they cannot live together with Russia, because the Russian goal is to destroy Ukraine and to turn Ukraine into the vassal dependent state like Belarus. And since Ukrainians do not want to live again in the new version of Soviet Union, with all its poverty, decadence, degradation, social and economic decline, they want to live in Europe, which has a higher living standards and which proposes the better security, social security and national security. So that's just the result of the Putin's policy, and his latest beginning of the war was just a major mistake, after which Ukrainians will rather fight to the very end, but would not agree to any kind of concessions to Russians.
With all those points that you have mentioned, Dr. Petro, we go to Dr. Basim Al-Haj, the researcher and analyst. How do these common factors are used politically, those similarities between the both people? Of course, this is used in the narrative, especially if we have noticed amongst the objectives of Russia when they have launched their military operation to Ukraine is to remove the neo-Nazis, as the Russians have described them. So they consider this as a duty based on that narrative that there is a joint history between both nations. Also, there were differences that emerged over many period, and also there is something we cannot overlook, that a big percentage of the Ukrainian people are Russian speakers, or they come from Russian origins. Therefore, we see that the Russian military actions before their political statements or even public ones is to protect the Russian citizens or the Russian-speaking people. All those factors, whether that are linked to the history or to the race or to religion or even to the geography, play a major role and a critical one, and cannot be ignored and not even be given importance, especially from all those statements come from Russia. But of course, there's the Ukrainian contradictory narrative that contradicts the Russian narrative. So it's the battle of narrative. But we cannot overlook in any way that there are roots that link both nations. However, although there were some differences over the history, the language, the culture, so there's also the tendency of Ukraine to move to the West, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union and Budapest Treaty, where Ukraine have given away the third biggest nuclear weapons in return of their independence. And also the first Ukrainian president said that this nuclear weapons were not an advantage for Ukraine. However, it was a threat. And the Iraqi decision maker have never had control over those weapons. And also there is this security, historical security obsession for Moscow, because they see this region with its western borders is crucial. And this is not only Ukraine-Russian border, but also Finland borders. So even Finland, as I have said, so when we have heard not long ago statements of Finland about the desire to change their position and their military or political neutrality and move towards the NATO after, of course, the war that we are witnessing then in Ukraine. We have seen responses from Russia. Same to those we have heard against Ukraine when they talked about joining or working toward joining the NATO, because in 2008, when the NATO have expressed its desire to open the door for Georgia and Ukraine to join. However, that was not well received by Russia, and we have heard the latest statement of President Zelensky, which does not even state clearly whether Ukraine will join the NATO or not. So there are so many historical, geographical obstacles. And all of that shed light on today's crisis. And of course, this is not only limited to one factor, because today we have seen that this crisis have so many political, economical factors, and the military one have complicated things and make things not limited to the geography, where we are witnessing an intensive Russian military presence. So it's not clear what is the Russian strategy and what are the next targets. Are they going to suffice by this piece of land or this geography? And after especially the strong response of from the West and this economic, also wide economic war that we are witnessing, that more severe in the cost than the military one. Now the anchor is interrupting and saying that in the Russian narrative, so the Russian narrative, Dr. Wissam, accusations to where Putin accused groups of Ukrainian people of Nazism affiliation, and how the Russian authority trying to use this Nazism pretext. Now the guest, Dr. Wasim, is reply saying that there is a reference to the big war, which is the winning over the Nazis. The agreement which Poland was divided between Stalin and Hitler came after the occupation of Germany to Poland. And based on that agreement, a part of the part that Poland have occupied in 1919 was given to Soviet Ukraine. So for the first time, we see the uniting Ukraine and bring Galicia, Eastern Galicia and Vorina to Mother Ukraine. Therefore, this Soviet Ukraine will be subject once again later, 2 years later, to the invasion of the Nazis armies and being occupied, and then the process of recovering that land by the Red Army of the Soviet Union and bring Ukraine back to the Soviet Union. And the demarcation of its border in Paris Agreement. But I want to emphasize that this vast size of federal Russia the problem of federal Russia is that it do not have a defensive borders. Therefore, Russia over the decades was try to expand their territory politically and geographically. Russia wanted doors to the world, whether in Middle Asia or through Eastern Europe, through Ukraine. Over the Ukraine plain, the Turkish invasion armies reached to Russia through two major wars. It was a conflict between two superpower. Land in Eurasia, the chess ground, there was also a conflict over sovereignty and dominance. On that map, federal Russia, they put Crimea in the middle of Eurasia that need to be controlled. Who rule Eastern Europe control the gates, and who control Crimea control Eurasia. Ukraine have or sees an important position in this chessboard. It is located in a very strategic position, and therefore Russia without Ukraine will not achieve their hegemony. it will not be an empire without Russia. Without Ukraine, wouldn't be an empire again. Ukraine is very important for Russia. The United States, therefore, try to prevent Russia from controlling 3 countries which consist 3 strategic pillars due to their geographical position and their natural resources, which are Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and Azerbaijan. Also, Ukraine for Europe is a buffer zone between Russia and Eastern Europe. And after Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland become a NATO members, Ukraine have become a bridge between Europe and Russia. On the other, so the Europeans try to protect themselves from any threats from the eastern flank. So by this we can read or understand the Russian insistence on taking control of Ukraine.
In order to have a missile defense system in Poland, Bulgaria, and others, this is why Russia insists on annexing the Crimea. We are still, it seems, discussing the importance of the Ukraine from a geopolitical point of view. We go back to Mr. Petro Bekovsky. Petro, in the Ukraine, there are people who speak Russian and speak Ukrainian, Christian Orthodox and Christian Catholics. In this case, why is Russia accusing the Ukraine of oppressing the Russian-speaking population?
We should start from the very beginning. So these talks are not new, and the Russian authorities were speaking about the oppressions and intimidation of Russian speakers from the very early years of Ukrainian independence, when Ukrainians tried to revert the outcomes, the results of the policy of deliberate Russification of the Ukrainian nation, and when Ukrainians re-established Ukrainian schools all over the country, when people could learn Ukrainian without any kind of oppression. And Russians just said that that's against their goals, that's against their interests, and they invented a narrative, a message that Ukrainians are trying to intimidate the Russians. Just I want to give you the very simple example and a demonstration to show you that it is not true. Last year, in February 2021, we conducted a nationwide poll in Ukraine, which included 2,000 respondents with the margin of error of 2%. So it's quite reliable and valid poll. And we asked people what language they consider as their native. So 78% of the respondents said that they consider Ukrainian as their native language, and 18% said that they consider Russian as their native language. Then we asked a second question. We asked every respondent, do you experience any kind of oppression or negative attitude toward yourself because of your native language? And even we were proudly surprised by the results, because 73 I just give you a scale. 73% of the people who said that they consider Russian language as their native language. So 73% of them said that they never in their life experienced any kind of discrimination or negative attitude because of their Russian language. 19% said that they had this kind of attitudes from time to time, and only 3.5% said that yes, they often see this kind of negative attitude because of their language. But on the other hand, we also had to admit that 12% of Ukrainians who think that Ukrainian language is their native also said that from time to time they experienced negative attitude because of their Ukrainian language. And 2% of Ukrainian speakers, they said that they often experience negative attitude because of their Ukrainian language. So the general picture is that there is no systematic, deliberate policy of intimidation or oppression of the Russian speakers. This is only Russian propaganda and their false justification for the war in Ukraine or for any kinds of unfriendly, hostile actions toward Ukraine. You also asked me about the difference between Orthodox and Catholics. However, in fact, the Catholics, they make only 12-13% of the total population, while the rest, up to 70%, they are Orthodox. So there is no disagreement between Catholics and Orthodox. There is disagreement inside the people who consider themselves as Orthodox Christian believers. And this difference, right now, it becomes smaller and smaller because even those people who, before the war, who thought and who considered a Russian patriarch as their chief, let's say, priest, they now rejecting their loyalty to him, and they start to join a Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which was established by the agreement between Constantinople Patriarch and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So right now, Putin's policy destroyed the last stronghold of the Russian ideology in Ukraine, the Moscow Patriarchate. More and more believers of Moscow Patriarchate, they quit from Moscow Patriarchate and they join the Ukrainian Patriarchate and Ukrainian Orthodox Church because they consider that the Moscow Patriarchate brings only hostility, hatred toward the other religion, and especially a hatred toward Ukrainians. So just also maybe my last comments to your question is that I ask you and all the speakers not to repeat the Russian narrative about Nazism in Ukraine, because Nazism is a well-defined and well-known concept. This is a political regime based on the ideology of the superiority of one nation over the other, and which allows this superior nation to intimidate, kill, conquer, and rule inferior nations. So nothing like this exists in Ukraine and never was existed. Just according to the assessment of the United Nations High Commissioner on Rights of the National Minorities several years ago, Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Petro. Sorry for interrupting you, but the time for this question is up. But we understand what you were saying. Please remain with us. And now we move to Dr. Bassem Al-Haj, and we ask him that there's a contradiction in the definition of the two nations where Putin considered the West as the source of all evils, and their values are different than the Russian values. However, Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, insists that Ukraine is part of Europe and the West. So what's the role of the West to form the identity of both countries? And is there indeed a Russian identity that contradicts the West? And are there any factors that make Ukraine attracted to the West? The guest is saying this is a very important question, and he says that is very complicated and hard to respond to because there are so many evaluations for this, because so many look to the West as the West is Europe. However, Russia is European, however, it's not Western. Japan, for example, it's Western, but it's not European. So we are talking about standards, values, cultures, politics, maybe. And this question, since we are talking about the Russian concerns from Ukraine joining the NATO, here we can pose two questions. The first one, are the Russian concerns related to historical concerns since the Soviet Union era from the Western bulk, which is represented by the NATO and approaching or getting closer to the Russian border, or the threat, the threats also of the Cold War era. So, based on the answer of those questions, there are so many countries that are in the NATO, but they have good relations with Russia. So, Ukraine cannot have worse relation whether they join or don't join the NATO. The other question about the Russian concern of Ukraine joining NATO to the alignment of the standards and values. This also, the answer for that could be yes. But I will also pose some hypothetical answer. If that's so, we might see countries in the European Unions and again, if we are just to analyze the Russian concerns, now we cannot say that the NATO is a patronage for democracy or a sponsor for. So the fear should be from the European Union more than the NATO. But when we see all those statements about Ukraine joining the NATO, we might find and not find this political sensitivity, Russian political sensitivity. On the contrary, we see some statements that the European Union is a structure, an economical structure and political one, unlike the NATO, where it's a militarily structure. So the European Unions might have, or the Russians might have some concerns about the European values, especially the homosexuality and others. But Ukraine, just like other countries who were part of the Soviet Union before or were affiliated with the Soviet Union, they wanted to follow the countries that perceived them and join the NATO or the European Union, since they consider it a good experience, a successful one, which features so many values and that fits them. So we are before two formulas. The first one, does it have to do with cultures and values and culture, or is it related to historical concern of the military alliance? Dr. Wasim Qal'aji.
Dr. Wasim Qal'achi, a question to you now. During the period when Stalin was ruling, millions of Ukrainians were killed. Do you think this is enough grounds for the Ukrainians to feel safe and have a state of coexistence with the Russians? Dr. Wasim is saying this famine was not specifically in the Ukraine. It was throughout the territories of the Soviet Union, and this is due to three reasons. First of all, because Stalin forced all the farmers to belong to co-ops and farming communities, and secondly, he wanted quick produce and expedite the process of turning the Soviet society into an industrial society. And this led to ignoring agriculture. But at the same time, there was drought, a general state of drought in 1932 in Russia, and there was bad climatic conditions. There was heavy snowfall on Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine territories. So therefore, this drought and famine together led to the situation that we're talking about, where millions of people died, and this has affected Ukrainians and others. But having said that, what causes concern now, three conditions in fact, or three factors relating to the military operation in the Ukraine. And these factors can lead to the death of hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of people. First of all, 10 to 15 laboratories to develop biological weapons, and these are weaponizing biological agents are presently in the Ukraine. And this has called Russia to call for an emergency meeting of the Security Council to draw attention to the work of these labs and how they're trying to spread the anthrax, which will impact Russia before anyone else. Secondly, what Zelensky said on the 22nd of February, when he said that Russia wants to invade the Ukraine and the Ukraine wants to join the NATO, is to create a buffer zone between the two sides, between the Western sides. This was the real reason for Ukraine wanting to join the NATO, and also to determine a timeline for this. This factor, and in conjunction with secret documents which were revealed lately, led to the NATO deploying 4 military brigades in the Ukraine, 2 land brigades and one air force and 1 naval. Sorry to interrupt you, Doctor. We're running out of time. We have to stop you there, but please stay with us. We're asking Mr. Petro Pergovsky now. In 3 minutes, please, Mr. Petro. Ukraine and Russia have close links between them. They are family ties. To what extent will these linkages impact Russia's stability or the Ukraine's stability if used politically?
Well, I would like to answer your question, but I cannot stand to listen. I was appalled by the fact how the previous speaker used the Russian false propaganda about famine. So first of all, dear doctor, you should know that the weather was good in 1932. And in 1932, there was an ordinary good harvest. And that year and the next year, Stalin exported a record grain toward the Europe. So this grain was taken away from the Ukrainian peasants, and that's why peasants died. There was no drought in Ukraine, and it was recorded even by the Soviet sources. So please check the sources you use and don't use the Russian propaganda. So secondly, you also said there are biological laboratories in Ukraine with no evidence presented anyway, and at any time. So no evidence were presented. That was just a statement of Russian officials from the Ministry of Defense. Just to remind you, the same officials said that they are not going to invade Ukraine up to the day of invasion. So I'm appalled to hear how these kind of fabricated facts are used. And so another important fact for you to understand the geopolitics of the Russian Federation and the Russian state. It's also recorded in the historical records. In 1898, the Imperial General Staff of the Russian Army made a report to the Russian king how many wars Russia fought between the year of 1700 till 1870. So they fought 38 wars, and 36 of these wars were offensive. From 1970 up to the year of 2020, Soviet Union and Russia fought 20 wars, and 18 of these wars were offensive. So they are saying that they are defending their country. However, all the time for the last 3 centuries, they attacked their neighbors, and this is a systemic policy of Russia. And this was proven even by the Russian official sources, by the Imperial General Staff, and later by the Soviet General Staff of the Russian Army. So please, I ask you not to repeat the falsified and fabricated facts. And finally, as about the family, I have family relatives in Russia, and my family also have many relatives in Russia. So they are divided. Majority of them believe in what Russian television is saying, and the little minority still keep their heads cool and do not buy Russian propaganda. But you have to understand that living in Russia and having the opposite opinion to the official is very dangerous. And so, therefore, people have to hide what they think in reality.
Mr. Petro, I just would like to clarify one important thing. This is an academic seminar. It's not political analyst. So each one of our guests rely on his resources to present the information that he has. And you are all here in order to exchange point of view and either to debunk them or refute them from time to time. So thank you very much for your answer. Please remain with us. We will go now to the social media segment. We will read some of the comment of our followers on the Facebook and Twitter, and then we will give you the chance to comment on those comments. Abdul Majid Abdul Salam on Facebook commented and say things get complicated, and now the impacts of the war is reflected on the whole world, especially economically speaking, which indicate that there are wars that will take place in other regions of the world, and then political solution and diplomatic ones will be useless. And Saeed al-Harari says that Russia have met or had achieved their objectives, and they have spread fear in the hearts of the Americans and Europeans. Another comment that Saif said, poor Ukraine, they were a victim between two superpowers confrontation. And Muhammad Atif says that a member state in the Security Council launching a war against a sovereign country and kill its people and destroy infrastructure. So what's the use of the Security Council of one of its member violates international laws and standards? We have Abu Saqar also says that the Rakan president is asking the support of the Jews because he know that they control the political decision in USA and in Europe. However, they will not support him. Now we will start with Dr. Basim Al-Haj Jassim to comment on the social media participation or comments. Before I comment, I would like to quickly talk about the biological labs in Ukraine. The Daily Mail today said or announced that they found documents confirm partially the truth of the Russian accusation about Biden's son implication in funding such also those labs or some of those labs in Ukraine. Of course, this crisis that have started a war is posing so many concerns and threats and risks. We have now political map or even a new geographical map, and what's most dangerous of it, that is not formed based on treaties and agreement, however based on a military operations. And also this war or this military operation have revived all the ideas, for example, disarmament, the focus on, and we have Germany as an example. And also this crisis may be more dangerous than the crises during the Cold War. Most of the crises in the Cold War, they were never a threat of using the nuclear weapon. However, in this crisis, we have heard 4 times mentioning of the usage of the nuclear weapons, started by Zelensky in his address and desire of his country to go back to the armament and leaving Budapest Agreement. And then we have heard Putin saying that Russia will do all what it could do to prevent Ukraine from coming back as a Ukrainian power. And also we have heard the Belarusian president saying that his country is willing to accept the Russian nuclear weapon on its territory. So the anchor is interrupting the guests, and she's moving to Dr. Wasim Qal'aji for a quick 1-minute response. Now, Wasim is saying if the United States of America have and the NATO accepted presenting written guarantees to Russia, wouldn't have this about the joining the NATO, Ukraine joining the NATO. All what Russia wanted, stop the expansion of the NATO and the West to their western flank, and not to deploy American troops on Ukraine, on the Russian borders. And thirdly, the NATO forces to reposition back on the 1997 borders, where they have reached a previous agreement. And lastly, the neutrality of Ukraine and not joining the NATO, which is something now the Ukrainian president is accepting. If then if guarantees were given to Russia, we wouldn't have seen this military operation. The talk about biological weapons in Ukraine, we believe that things might escalate and became worse. The more the NATO is trying to get involved, the more Ukraine is subject to longer military presence. The last comment from Mr. Petro. Please, 1 minute, Mr. Petro.
Yes, thank you very much. I just want to remind to our respected audience and to other key guests that in the 90s, NATO, the Western countries, the Western European countries, they didn't want to expand NATO, but the countries in the Central and Eastern Europe who just freed themselves from the Soviet oppression and Soviet control, they looked for the means how to prevent re-emergence of Russian imperialism and how to prevent them and to protect them from becoming a new colonies of Russia when Russia would become stronger. So they asked and they worked hard to join NATO in order to protect themselves from another Russian assertiveness. And believe me, if the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, small Baltic countries, had not entered the NATO, Russia would have stricken them first, because they are little, they have little armies, and the Russians would destroy their sovereignty. So right now there is a false narrative that NATO is approaching the borders of Russia. The countries, the former Russian colonies, who were free for just last 30 years, They looked for the opportunity to save their statehood and their independence, and the only alternative in Europe was a NATO, and the same alternative remains for Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Petro. By this, we reach the end of our first session. Now, we would like to thank our guests from Jeddah, Dr. Basil Al-Haj Jasser from Trablus, Lebanon, Dr. Wasim Qalajia, and from Doha, Dr. Petro Berkovsky. Thank you very much for being with us. We shall meet you later or after a while in the second session, which is the unclear neutrality. Thank you very much.